teacher. Today I'll have roughly 25, 30 minutes of me talking, and then we've got a bit of an interactive exercise, as Hannah mentioned, on the platform Mural, which is hopefully fairly easy to use if you've not done so before. And then at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for questions as well. I'm sure you'll know as you've signed up for this session, and it says it on this slide, I'm going to be talking about map critique. And I use the word map, but it refers to maps and geographic data visualizations, which is kind of a broader umbrella term for anything that might be using geospatial data, showing something in a kind of geographic context that isn't always your standard kind of static paper map. The sorts of things that might include dashboards or charts or graphs, that kind of comes within that geographic data visualization umbrella term. And it's a really useful tool to have in any data visualization or cartographer's arsenal, and I'll go into that a little bit more later in the session as to why that is. But just starting off with a bit of an introduction so you know who is speaking to you for the next hour. My name's Jess. I work as a technical relationship consultant in the CATS team, or the Consultancy and Technical Services team at Ordnance Survey, which is a team that probably a lot of you, if you're PSGA customers or partners of Ordnance Survey, you will have spoken to us before. I specialise in geographic data visualization, which, as I said, is that kind of creating customized geographic data outputs to show different things, different data sets, and get to do some really cool, creative stuff with geographic data. And I've been doing that for about 2 years now. So I'll start off with what the definition of critique actually is. So it's nice and short, a detailed analysis or assessment of something. And it's a really good thing to be open to receiving critique of your maps or data visualization. You might not always completely agree with some of the points that are being made to you, but map design, like any design of anything, is a subjective thing, and it's going to differ person to person. You're probably unlikely to receive exactly the same points from different people who are giving you critique of work that you've done. But understanding why it's important and that it can help you to improve is a really powerful thing. And you don't necessarily need to call it a critique. Sometimes that can feel a little bit awkward. You could call it a review or a quality check, proof checking. They're all kind of referring to the same thing, but sometimes it just helps with making it feel a little bit less personal, I suppose. And we all like praise, don't we, when we've done something well, done some good work. And that's a really nice thing to receive and is important in its own ways. But getting feedback and critique on your work is equally as important. It can help to make your maps or data visualizations better. By getting the perspectives of other people, you can really be sure that the message you're trying to give with the data visualization and the thing that you want people to take away from it is what's coming through. It can be easy, I think, sometimes when you've spent a long time working on a particular project to kind of get that sense of perspective and to take a step back and really think about what the first impressions would be of somebody who was to see it. It forces you to think about the way that you work as well, and constructive criticism and critique can help to guide you away from the kind of bad working practices and towards ones which are a bit more efficient or a bit easier to do, that kind of learning from your past mistakes. And it can be a really good advantage as well. It's really a privilege to be able to have access to map critique. If you think about people who might work on their own or be freelance, they don't have those colleagues who would be able to offer that kind of educated advice and informed critique. So if you've got the ability to have it, really use that to your advantage and make the most of it. Now we've got this diagram on this slide, which I really like. It's from a person called Judith Tyner, who was a professor of geography at California State University in 2010. And she released a book called Principles of Map Design, which includes this diagram, all about the map making process. So you'd start off obviously by planning and thinking about what the purpose of your map or data visualization is and what the message is that you want to get across with that, maybe the topic that you're going to focus on and who that audience is going to be, whether that's academics, members of the public, people who've got a specific interest in something. That's really important to consider when you're putting your map or data visualization together. And then obviously you've got an element of data analysis. You're going to get your data from somewhere, whether you're collecting that yourself or whether it's coming from your organisation or coming from a third-party organisation. And then thinking about whether there's any data prep or analysis that's required before you then display that visually. And then you're going to want to think about how you're going to present that information. So how you're going to lay it out on a page, whether it's going to be a physical map or something that's seen on an interactive web map, for example, or as part of an API or a story map. Thinking about the composition of it and all of those different elements that you're including and how they fit together. And that's a really kind of key part that often I think gets overlooked. And then the last kind of stage before the map goes into production is the critique. And I think this is often one that gets overlooked or missed out if people are working with quite tight deadlines. It seems like a less important part of the process, but actually really can be a lifesaver in terms of picking up some of those easily made mistakes and just making sure that all of the work that you've done to get to that point has been as worthwhile as possible, because it's a real shame if you put ages and ages of time and effort into creating something and then just a few little mistakes towards the end mean that it doesn't get received in the way that it should be. So I find it quite helpful when talking to people about map critique to actually give an idea of the sort of things that we're talking about that you can consider. And this is a nice way to have a kind of starter for 10 when you're looking at somebody else's work and thinking, I don't know what I should be checking against, or I don't know where to start with this. So this is a useful list, and I'll go through each of these things as well that you can think about when you're critiquing your own or other people's maps or data visualizations. So first and foremost, what the purpose of it is, that kind of the concept of the map and what it's being created to do, and why are you making a map really, rather than writing some information down or showing it in a table. What's showing your information visually going to achieve over those other things? And often I obviously am pro creating maps and data visualizations and visual things, as lots of us are. Ordnance Survey, I think it's a very powerful way to convey a lot of messages, but sometimes it's not necessarily always completely necessary. And then think about the content of the map, whether it's showing the right kind of data, whether the analysis of that data has been done correctly, and if it's showing the information in a logical and easy to understand way. It's a real shame if you spend a really long time creating something very beautiful and really thinking about the composition and the design of your map, and then actually coming to the end of it and thinking, oh, this doesn't really do what I was trying to show with the map and try and get through with it. The projection of the map is also an important consideration. Obviously, at Ordnance Survey, we work with Great Britain and we work in British National Grid most of the time. But if you're creating maps and data visualizations of other places around the world, you want to make sure that you're choosing the right datum and the right coordinate system and the right projection to show that information. So there's really useful websites online that you can check your data and check which area of the world you're working in and what the best projection is to show with that. And often if you're using more than one data set on top of each other or together, you want to make sure that they're all in the same projection as well, because that can cause a lot of issues if not. Then thinking about the method that's been used to create the map, so whether they're creating a topographic map or you're creating a topographic map that's kind of more for finding where a place is or showing something in the context of its wider geographic location, or if you're creating maybe a thematic map, so something like a choropleth map or a dot density map, which is showing kind of spatial patterns of some information and wanting to be a bit more analytical with it. Thematic maps often get a bit confused, and there's kind of considerations to make with certain types of thematic maps, like choropleth maps, where you want to make sure that the data has been normalized so that it is portraying the information in the right way and it's not misleading the people who are using it. Then thinking about things like a key or a legend. Sometimes I think people can whack all of these different elements onto a map or a data visualization without real consideration for whether they actually need to be there. You know, you don't always need a key or a legend on a map. Sometimes it's fairly self-explanatory as to what's going on and what you're looking at, but it sometimes isn't. So absolutely think about that with a kind of critical mindset. The size of the legend as well, and the actual symbols that you're using to show different features. Are they appropriate? Are they doing the job that they need to be doing in the best way possible? Thinking about the colours that have been used as well, whether they are things like accessible to people with colour blindness or colour vision deficiency, whether the colour scheme that's been used is appropriate for the data set that's being used, if that's a diverging colour scheme or a sequential colour scheme, that's the right one to be using. And if it's really garish and bright as well, it can kind of put people off looking at a map or a data visualization sometimes. And then thinking about the layout of the page, how the kind of composition of it all looks, and whether it's nice to look at, and whether all of the elements work together and are of the same kind of style. Thinking about the title as well, if that is accurately explaining what's going on in the map or data visualization, there needs to be a title. Often it's a pretty handy thing to have, but it doesn't always necessarily need to be there. And then also thinking about, with regards to text, the size of different labels, the fonts that have been used, whether they've been placed in appropriate places, or if they're being used to label along features like a river or a road, for example, if they're orientated the correct way and are clear as to what they're supposed to be labeling. And then the scale of the map or data visualization as well. If first and foremost the map is being shown at the correct scale and has a suitable level of detail for what you're trying to show with your map, but also if you've included this scale bar, whether the units are appropriate, whether they're correct or not. I saw a map the other day that was from the BBC of Canada, and instead of writing kilometres, they'd written metres, and it said that the whole of Canada was about 500 metres wide, which is obviously not true. I think that was very quickly rectified, but just little mistakes like that, which can happen to anybody, you know, if you're working to a deadline and working quickly, they can often just get picked up by map critique where they might not have been otherwise. So hopefully you're all convinced and you're all keen to go and do some map critique or receive some map critique on your next project. But we just want to show a few examples of where things have gone really wrong that map critique probably could have helped to avoid. So it can stop things like this happening. This was a map that was released by a German news source at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You can see there's just shed loads of arrows, which is really overwhelming. You look at this map and you think, like, really? Is that something that actually went out in the press? But I think it can be really easy to lose sight of that bigger picture when you're creating a data visualization piece. And if you're really working on it for a few days and you really get close to it, you think you're understanding what you're trying to show, but actually when you take a step back, somebody else looks at it for the first time and think, whoa, that's very overwhelming and not clear at all as to what's actually going where and what's happening. So yeah, if you don't have somebody to give you critique on your map, maybe just take a day or two away from that project and then come back to it with a fresh set of eyes. That can be really helpful. Then we've got this example, which was on CNN, and you can see that there's some pretty glaring labeling errors that have happened here. This can be easily done when you're creating visualizations in a rush, and tight deadlines can sometimes make us feel like map critique is a part of the process that can be sacrificed if you're trying to test something out really quickly. But it's always worth factoring in time to make sure that that is being done for everything that's going out, whether that's just something that's being circulated internally within your organization or something which is going out more widely to your customers or clients, or on your social media channels, for example, just to save really embarrassing mistakes like this, which are going to reflect badly on yourself as somebody who's making the project, but also your organization more widely. And then we've got an example here where I think this is showing total fatalities from COVID-19, again, around the USA. And you can see here they've included the categories for each of the different color classifications that they're using to show the data. And they go from 10,000 to 30,000, and then there's a big gap, and then they go straight to 80,000 plus. So this is probably either due to an error in the data where there isn't any data in between those two, or a simple typo. And this is easily missed, but something that somebody else will probably pick up on quite quickly if they're looking at your map with a bit more detail. So if you're happy to accept critique of your maps as well, it's also really beneficial to be able to give constructive critique to other people's maps. And we've got some tips here that hopefully will make it feel a little bit less of an awkward process or a little bit less personal when you're giving or receiving that critique. So the first of these is that it's not about you. It's not a personal kind of analysis of your work. It's really objective and looking at the thing that you've made and making sure that it is achieving what you want it to. The map should really be critiqued on its own merit and not kind of examined through your own personal kind of thoughts on the topic that it's showing, or your own kind of preferences as to how you like things to be designed, things like that. It's also really important to be respectful and to be honest as well when you're giving critique, and respecting the work that somebody else has done. Remember that the person who's created it has probably put quite a lot of time into it, and care about how it's been constructed and the data that's gone into it as well. So just be truthful and be honest, but kind of maintain that respect towards the person who's created it. And then we suggest avoiding kind of wishy-washy phrases as well when you're giving critique. So try and be quite objective, and this ties in with the next point as well, and specific about the things that you're actually talking about, rather than saying like, oh, I think it looks really nice, or I think, you know, it's a really good map, or it does a really good job. Try and be specific about, oh, I think the colour scheme is really suitable for the data set that you've chosen, or the base map has got an appropriate level of detail, or actually I think that the key could be formatted this way to be clearer to the user who's looking at the map or data visualization. And then the fifth point, asking why. So this is a really useful way to actually understand the design choices and the kind of way that the map has been put together from the person who created it. Asking questions about why they maybe used certain shades, or why they used a specific thematic mapping technique, can really help to understand some of those decisions and question whether they're the right ones, or actually offer alternative suggestions. And that leads us on to the last point here, which is around giving suggestions back to the person who you're critiquing. So rather than it just being a really long list of, oh, I wouldn't do this, or this is bad and this is wrong, maybe suggesting an alternative colour palette, or suggesting a better way to visualize that data, or being specific about removing certain things from the base map, or adding things as kind of contextual information around the edge, so that they've kind of got something to go off when they're then making those edits to create the second draft. And we have this slide. It's a bit of a kind of novel kind of concept, but I think it helps when you're delivering critique to somebody. We call it the love sandwich, and basically we talk about putting your piece of critique in between two positive comments around the map or data visualization. It just helps to kind of take the edge off a little bit. Maybe you want to try this, maybe you don't, maybe it feels a bit weird, but it can be a good sort of starting point, and really encouraging for people as well if they put a lot of work into something and then, you know, are getting critique on it for the first time. And I include this slide because I think that there is a kind of fine line between map critique being a really constructive and positive thing that can be used to encourage people and to make people better at what they're doing and make their work better. And then actually that shifting into just kind of bashing somebody's work for the sake of it, and doing that in a very disrespectful way, or not really giving them space to explain why they've chosen what they've done, or why they've made the decisions that they did in the way that they visualize something. So we don't want, you know, the map critique process to be a kind of a gatekeeping thing. If it's done in the right way, in a constructive, respectful way, it can be really helpful for others and in understanding the way that we work and the way that other people work, rather than making people feel ashamed or not want to share their work or progress as they improve. Because, you know, we all started somewhere, and we've probably seen different kind of quality levels in our work as we've got more skills or use different types of software and have learned throughout all of that. And so we really want to encourage people to share their work and to be keen to join the community of people who are creating these things, which is a really nice and positive one most of the time. So I talk about kind of performative critique, which is that sort of bashing somebody's work for the sake of it, versus constructive critique, which is genuinely useful, both to yourself if you're giving it, or yourself if you're receiving it. So hopefully that's been a kind of useful introduction to map critique, what it is, why we do it, what sort of things we might talk about, how it can be useful. the first of the 6. This is a map that shows where different minerals are mined from around the world. So I'll just give you that context as to what each of the maps are before you go off and start writing your thoughts and comments and giving the scores. But yeah, I'll be quiet for a couple of minutes now, and you can get your thoughts down on that mural board, and then I'll come back and we can chat through some of the comments and things that are on there. And then we'll do the same thing for each of the 6. Okay, thank you. I can see lots of comments and stars moving things on the mural board, which is excellent. So I'll go through a couple of those. I'll just put this back on the screen so you can see where we are. It looks like most people are giving it between a 1 and a 4, so a bit on the lower end of the scale. And I can see lots of comments around the colour choices. It's a pretty bright, garish, not very aesthetically pleasing colour choice. I would agree with that. And it's a little confusing, a few people are saying, because the colours of different bits of text are quite different, and it doesn't really give much explanation as to why. So asking around that would be a good idea. And then I like this question around thinking about using a pie chart instead of text. I think that would be a much clearer way to show that kind of breakdown, especially in these countries where there's lots of different minerals that are coming from them, as to what the breakdown of those in each of them actually is. Let me take that one back off and go back to PowerPoint. I think some of the thoughts that I had on this one as well were around the countries being very generalized as well on the base map. It's pretty kind of smooth lines which aren't actually accurate to the boundaries of countries themselves, which I don't know if there's much merit in them doing that. I think it would be nice to have a more geographically accurate base map. And I saw one of the comments on mural as well around having country borders in there too, which would be helpful, I think, with understanding actually the geographical makeup and the kind of spatial patterns of these mineral areas as well. And also I think that they've labelled a few countries which doesn't look like do have any minerals coming from them. I'm not sure if Japan does. And the kind of placement of those labels seems a little bit confused to me too, with Russia kind of going to the top left of it, but then others sort of sitting below, and it's kind of tricky to understand which labels refer to each of the countries. So let's move on to our second map, and I'll just go onto the mural board and let you all access that. So this is a poster style map showing the French transport network kind of coming out of Paris, going towards different parts of the country. So it serves slightly different purposes. Kind of think about who the user is of these maps, and what the aim of the map is as well when you're giving your scores and your critique. But we're going to go. Okay, let's have a look at the mural board and see what we've got on this one. So a little bit higher scores, kind of 5s to 7s, and comments wise, we've got the map requires a legend. Not sure what the difference between the red and the blue colours are. Yeah, I completely agree with that. It would have been quite easy to have kind of a couple of little points towards the edge, I think, that would make that more easy to understand. Nice clean design. Yeah, I agree with that. But questions around the outer hexagons and whether they're zones or maybe just for aesthetic purposes, and if there's something zone-wise, it'd be useful to label those. It looks to me like they are other countries, but it doesn't make that very obvious. I can see them going to London, Amsterdam, Zurich, Milan. Some larger text or a legend would be helpful. You can see there's, yeah, no scale or anything. North arrows, agree. I'm not sure what size this map would have been printed at as a poster, but some of the text is quite small and quite hard to read. And yes, somebody writing around data publication, because obviously as the railway network changes, this could become out of date quite quickly. So just useful to know what you are comparing it against. Really nice, thank you for adding those comments. I think I'd also add that the base map is really nice on this one. You know, it doesn't need to have any kind of other information to give it that contextual sort of geographical context. So I think just having a white outline of France actually works really well here. But because it is an A2 or A3, however large it is, poster, and France is quite sort of hexagonal shaped or almost square shaped, there's a lot of empty space around the edge. Maybe this could have been better as a square poster, potentially. Okay, great, thank you. Then let's move on to our third example, which is this hexagon map showing the number of pubs and bars per capita across Great Britain. And what the person who's created this map is aggregate those into the different local authority areas and put those into the kind of rough shape of Great Britain, which is why it looks all a little bit squished and distorted, that you can see here. Let me go back onto Mural and get rid of this box over that one. And yeah, same process again. We'll go for another few minutes. Intrigued to hear your thoughts on this one. Okay, let's have a look at some comments. So we've got people saying the text labeling is confusing as to which area is which, where the labels are referring to. Too much text would replace the text with a table, poor analytical presentation. But then we've got some people saying there's good presentation of a complex data set, so you can see how it's often quite a subjective thing and depends how you like to receive information. The squash look is a bit distracting and the floating county blobs make it difficult to concentrate on the message. Yeah, I think that's a valid point. I would agree with that. And somebody questioning whether it's only selected local authorities or if all local authorities are just the ones with more than 100,000 people in them. And somebody saying that the colour scheme doesn't show the number of pubs clearly enough and the labels don't clearly highlight areas. So yeah, all interesting points. And I think this is quite a unique data visualization technique. I've not seen many that have been done like this before. And for me, I think it is a little bit confusing, but I quite liked sort of trying to really understand what it was telling me. But maybe that's not super effective if you're trying to get your message across quickly to somebody. I think they've used a lot of labels that also overlap the coast, which is generally quite bad practice. It's a little bit hard to read some of those. And this map has chopped off Orkney and Scotland, Orkney and Shetland, sorry, on the top of Scotland, which people tend not to like if they live up there. but I think it uses quite a nice color scheme personally. That's my kind of personal preference for this sort of data set, which goes from something that's not a lot of something to a lot of something. I think this is a nice color scheme to use. But yeah, interesting to see. Some people liked this way of showing information, some people not so much, and thought it was a bit confusing. Okay, let's go on to the last three. So I'll take this box away. And here we have got a precipitation and flood risk map for the Western USA. And again, I'll let you go away and have a few minutes to write your thoughts on this one. Okay, having a look at the mural board here, we've got a real mix of people going from 0 to 6, which is quite a broad spectrum, I would say, of thoughts on it initially. Lots of people saying that it's a bit confusing as to where the inset map relates to on the backdrop map, like one wider contextual one. And I have to admit, it took me quite a long time of looking at this map to actually realise it was an inset map. So would completely agree with that. That's not very clearly laid out on the page, but it might be clear as two separate images, some people are saying. The colours being used on the map have been picked up on quite a lot as well, as not being accessible and being distracting, hard to interpret. And I think we often avoid or suggest avoiding using these kind of rainbow spectral colour schemes in anything to do with visualization, really, because they're really hard for people with colour blindness, different types of colour blindness, to understand and actually be able to distinguish which colours are being shown there. So they can be pretty inaccessible for that. A few people saying that the legend text is tricky to read as well, and it's kind of placed in an odd way too. Yeah, I would agree. It's kind of on top of that really bright contrast color. It doesn't make it very easy to see, or even work out actually which bits relate to each classification in the legend. I think it would be easier to see if it included some numbers maybe as to what denotes an extreme precipitation risk versus a notable precipitation risk. I think there's a few points which could help to make this map a lot more legible and just easy to interpret and understand at first glance as well. Okay, so the next one is this map from the BBC, which shows reservoir levels across England from, I think, March 2023, so a pretty recent one. Let you write some thoughts on that one. Okay, let's have a look at some comments from this one. So we've got a few people saying that it's a really nice clean map with a clear message. It's fairly simple, which often is good for data visualizations and maps. You know, less can often be more with these things. But a few people talking about labels and having a few county labels or labels for the reservoirs that they're referring would be really helpful. I completely agree with that, especially the reservoirs, which is, you know, the key data set that they're showing in this map. It's going to be tricky to know what the reservoirs actually are if you're not familiar with them. And the title as well, there's a couple of comments on that, but it's a bit misleading because it talks about key reservoirs in England, but they are showing some reservoirs in Wales as well, and it references that 3 of those are helping to provide water to England, but actually there are 4 points shown, so that's a little bit confusing. What else have we got? Not sure what the black bordered areas represent. Yeah, agree. I think they don't probably add a huge amount to the kind of message of the map, especially because they've not got any labels, so it's tricky to understand what they actually are. And a couple of comments on the colour scheme as well. Tricky to see the lightest colour that's being used. It doesn't show up very well against the backdrop colour, and that maybe the colour range is a little bit difficult to differentiate between those categories, and that a divergent colour scale might be better. All good points, all really interesting and useful, so thank you. I think that covers all of the comments and thoughts that I had on this one as well, so nice and fair. And then let's go on to the final map, which is this one, which is a topographic map showing some of the Great Lakes across the United States and Canada. So again, pop some thoughts on that one. This will be the last one of our 6 in the interactive section of the webinar today. Okay, let's have a look at some of the comments on this final example. So we've got a kind of spectrum from 1 to 5 on the scoreboard, and we've got some people commenting on the labels. So they have been cut off at the edge of the map, which is bad practice. You want the whole label to be visible and legible and readable. We're going to include it at all. And people talking about missing legends with the dark brown colours that have been used and blues as well. All labels being the same font and size has been picked up on by a few people, so they've all just been shown in exactly the same way to label lots of different types of things, which is a little bit confusing when you're trying to relate which labels are referring to which features on the map. Somebody's speaking about the figureground relationship, which is a really nice phrase to use. We speak about that sometimes in our team at OS, which is the relationship between those things that are in the foreground and those things which are in the background, and how they relate to each other, and the way that you want people to notice things in a certain order when they're looking at your map or data visualization. Yeah, lots of people picking up on how the different styling between the different labels could be used to make things a lot more easy to interpret on this map. Brilliant. Thank you very much for engaging with that and interacting with that. And actually, just on that last map, I've got this example, which is the one you just looked at, but then actually how things can be improved through critique. And let's just say that you've spoken to the person who created this data visualization, fed those comments back to them, and they've created something that looks more like this, where you've got the labels shown in different fonts. Some are in all caps, some are in upper and lower, different colors to show things like the lakes versus the states and the cities. And I think we probably would all agree here that this is just much easier to understand. It's a nicer map to look at visually as well, and just generally does a better job at communicating the message that it was created to achieve. So you can see how useful that map critique can be. It's something that we in our team at Ordnance Survey do a lot. Whenever any of us create a map or data visualization, we will always share it with the other members of our team so that we can get some feedback and just continually be making better outcomes in our work as well, that are going to be more successful in their aims. So that brings me to the end of my section of talking, and we've got about 5-7 minutes of any time for questions. If anybody has got any, I'm more than happy to take those now. Alternatively, if you think of anything and you want to get in touch via email, you can do that with the email address on the screen here. And this is my Twitter handle as well. I think there's a really nice geospatial community on Twitter of people sharing their work, and there's some really fantastic initiatives there. Things like the 30-day map challenge, which a lot of you have probably heard of, which is an annual kind of initiative that runs every November, where people are invited to create maps and data visualizations on a certain theme each day, and everybody will be creating them on the same theme each day. And it's a real nice opportunity to be able to see a huge spectrum of work, and people are often very happy to give constructive critique and be really helpful to their peers on there as well. So it's a great way to see that critique being done really well in a really nice positive environment too. So yeah, I'd highly recommend getting involved with that if you haven't before.